The sound of screeching tires pierced the tranquil Saturday morning as Thomas Mitchell looked up from pruning his roses. A silver SUV had pulled into his neighbor's driveway so abruptly that the vehicle rocked back and forth before settling. Thomas sighed, laying down his gardening shears. Karen Westfield had arrived, and peace in the suburban cul-de-sac of Oakwood Drive was about to be shattered once again. Karen emerged from her vehicle like a storm cloud, designer sunglasses perched atop her highlighted blonde bob, clipboard in hand. As the newly elected HOA president of the Meadowbrook Estates, she had taken to performing what she called compliance inspections with frightening regularity. Thomas had hoped to avoid her this weekend, but it seemed luck wasn't on his side. "Good morning, Karen," Thomas called with forced cheerfulness, wiping his soil-covered hands on his jeans. At 58, the retired civil engineer had hoped to spend his golden years in quiet enjoyment of the home he worked 30 years to pay off. Instead, the past 6 months have been a constant battle against Karen's increasingly bizarre and restrictive interpretations of the Homeowner Association bylaws. Karen barely acknowledged his greeting with a curt nod before marching toward his backyard gate. Without asking permission, she pushed it open and strode in as if she owned the property. "Excuse me," Thomas said, hurrying after her. "You can't just enter my backyard without permission. As HOA president, I have the right to inspect all visible areas for compliance issues," Karen stated without slowing down or looking back at him. Her voice carried that particular timbre of someone who believed their authority was absolute and unquestionable. Thomas clenched his jaw but followed her into his backyard, where his pride and joy, an above-ground pool he had installed 5 years ago for his grandchildren, glistened in the morning sun. It wasn't large or fancy, just 12 feet in diameter and 4 feet deep, but his grandkids loved it during their summer visits. Karen circled the pool, her pen tapping rapidly against her clipboard as she took notes. Thomas could practically see the gears turning in her head, searching for violations where none existed. "This pool isn't approved," she finally declared, turning to face him with an expression of smug triumph. Thomas blinked in confusion. "What are you talking about? It's been here for 5 years. The previous HOA board approved it before installation." Karen's lips stretched into a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The board has revised the community guidelines. Above-ground pools are now classified as temporary structures and require seasonal approval. You haven't submitted the proper paperwork this year." "That's ridiculous," Thomas said, his voice rising slightly. "There was nothing in the newsletter about new pool regulations." "It was discussed and voted on at last month's meeting," Karen replied, her tone dripping with condescension. "Perhaps if you attended the meetings instead of skipping them, you'd be informed of the changes." Thomas felt heat rising to his face. He had missed last month's meeting because he was in the hospital having his gallbladder removed. In fact, Karen knew perfectly well since he had emailed her his medical excuse. "You have 14 days to either remove the pool or submit an application for approval," Karen continued, ripping a yellow citation from her clipboard and holding it out to him. "Application fee is $200, non-refundable, of course." Thomas stared at the yellow paper, not reaching for it. "This pool has been grandfathered in. You can't retroactively apply new rules to existing structures." Karen's smile faltered slightly. She wasn't used to being challenged. "The bylaws give the board discretion to modify regulations as needed." Section 8, Paragraph 12. Thomas crossed his arms. "And Section 3, Paragraph 5 specifically protects homeowners from retroactive enforcement of aesthetic changes. I helped write those bylaws, Karen. I was on the original board that established this HOA 20 years ago." For a moment, Karen seemed taken aback. Then her eyes narrowed dangerously. "Either way, there's another issue," she said, her voice hardening. "Your pool extends 3 inches beyond the recreational installation zone in your backyard plat. That's a clear violation that can't be grandfathered." Thomas knew in that moment that this was just the beginning of what would become the neighborhood battle of the decade, one that would eventually lead to police cars, property disputes, and a community divided. The following week passed in a haze of research and growing frustration for Thomas. He had spent hours poring over the HOA bylaws, contacting previous board members, and even consulting with his daughter Jessica, who worked as a property attorney in the city. The more he investigated, the more convinced he became that Karen's sudden pool vendetta was less about regulations and more about a personal power trip. "Dad, you need to document everything," Jessica advised during their Sunday phone call. "Karen might be overstepping her authority, but you need to build your case methodically." Thomas had already begun compiling a folder. In it, he placed photos of at least 6 other above-ground pools in the neighborhood, the original approval documentation from 5 years ago, and a highlighted copy of the HOA charter that specifically limited the board's ability to enforce retroactive aesthetic changes without a 2/3 neighborhood vote. On Wednesday afternoon, while Thomas was adding to his documentation, a knock at the door interrupted his concentration. He opened it to find Mike Hernandez, his next-door neighbor and the HOA board treasurer, standing awkwardly on his porch. "Hey, Tom," Mike said, his usually friendly face creased with discomfort. "Got a minute?" Thomas invited him in, offering coffee, which Mike gratefully accepted. They sat at the kitchen table, the spring breeze drifting through the open window as suburban life continued outside. "I wanted to talk to you about this pool situation," Mike began, staring into his coffee mug rather than meeting Thomas' eyes. "Look, I voted against these new regulations. I thought you should know that." Thomas felt a surge of appreciation. "Thanks for telling me, Mike. So these changes really did pass?" Mike nodded reluctantly. By one vote, Karen pushed it through while 3 members were absent, including Diane, who always votes with your interests in mind. The timing wasn't coincidental. "And what about this recreational installation zone business? Is my pool really in violation?" Mike finally looked up, his expression uncomfortable. "That's where things get murky. Karen hired her cousin as a compliance consultant last month. He's the one who did the measurements and claimed your pool is 3 inches over the line." Thomas felt his blood pressure rising. Her cousin? That's a clear conflict of interest. "I know," Mike said, lowering his voice despite them being alone. "But Karen's got half the board terrified of her. When Richard questioned the consultant hire, she threatened to report his unauthorized garden shed extension to the county for permit violations." As they continued talking, Thomas learned that Karen had moved into Meadowbrook Estates just 8 months ago, but had quickly maneuvered her way into the HOA presidency when the previous president relocated for work. Since then, violation citations had increased by 300%, and the HOA had collected over $15,000 in fines and application fees. "The thing is," Mike continued, draining his coffee, "your pool isn't the real target. Karen's been talking to developers about installing a community pool and clubhouse. She wants to use HOA funds to purchase the empty lot at the end of the cul-de-sac." Thomas frowned. "But that would require a special assessment. Each household would have to pay thousands." "Exactly," Mike confirmed. "And she's counting on using that money for the initial deposit before the vote even happens. But she needs to establish a precedent that private pools violate HOA guidelines first. So she's targeting existing pools to eliminate competition for her pet project." Thomas was incredulous. Mike nodded grimly. "You're just the first because you missed that meeting. She's planning to go after the Wilsons next, then the Paddles." After Mike left, Thomas sat at his kitchen table, staring out his backyard where his grandchildren had spent countless summer hours splashing and laughing in the pool. His resolve hardened. This wasn't just about a pool anymore. It was about one person's abuse of power and manipulation of community rules for personal gain. That evening, Thomas emailed every homeowner in Meadowbrook Estates. The subject line read, "URGNT, special HOA meeting requested. Your property rights at risk." He carefully detailed what he had learned, included scans of the relevant bylaw sections, and requested an emergency community meeting to address Karen's leadership. Within hours, his inbox was flooded with responses from neighbors sharing their own stories of Karen's overreach. The Johnsons had been fined for a basketball hoop that had been in their driveway for a decade. The Abbotts were cited for their children's treehouse, which predated the HOA entirely. The Torres family received a violation for their holiday decorations being culturally inconsistent with community standards. As Thomas read through the responses, his phone rang. It was Karen. "I'm only going to say this once," she said without preamble, her voice ice cold. "Remove that pool and retract your email by noon tomorrow, or I'll make your retirement years a living hell." Thomas took a deep breath. "No, Karen, I don't think I will." The silence on the other end was deafening before she spoke again. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she hissed and hung up. Thomas placed his phone down and walked to his window, gazing out at his pool shimmering in the evening light. He knew the battle lines had been drawn, but he had no idea just how ugly things were about to become. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning at the community pavilion. Thomas arrived 30 minutes early to set up his presentation materials, but found the pavilion's doors locked with a hastily printed sign, "Meeting CNCLED to SCHGULN conflict." "Unbelievable," he muttered, pulling out his phone to text the neighbors. Within minutes, cars began arriving anyway. Janet Liu, who lived 3 doors down from Thomas, approached with a determined expression. "Karen can't just cancel a properly requested meeting," she said, her voice firm. "The bylaws are clear. If 20% of homeowners petition for a special meeting, it must be held within 10 days. As more neighbors gathered in the parking lot, a collective decision was made to relocate to Thomas's backyard, the site of the original conflict and fittingly the largest private outdoor space in the neighborhood. Thomas couldn't help but smile at the irony. By 11 o'clock, over 40 homeowners had assembled in his backyard, many seeing his infamous pool for the first time. Lawn chairs formed impromptu rows facing Thomas's deck, where he had set up his presentation boards. The atmosphere was charged with a sense of community rebellion. "First, I want to thank everyone for coming," Thomas began, looking out at the faces of neighbors he lived alongside for years, but had rarely spoken with beyond casual greetings. "I believe we're facing a critical moment for our community." He methodically laid out everything he had discovered: the manipulated voting, the conflict of interest with Karen's cousin as the compliance consultant, and the planned community pool project that would require thousands from each household. Richard Patel, who served on the Architectural Review Committee, stood up. "Karen rejected 3 of my approvals last month without committee consultation. That's a direct violation of procedure." Others began sharing their stories: arbitrary fines, inconsistent rule enforcement, and retaliatory actions when anyone questioned Karen's authority. The common thread became clear. Karen wasn't just a difficult neighbor. She was systematically undermining the HOA's intended purpose of preserving property values and instead using it as a personal fiefdom. "We need to call for a vote of no confidence," suggested Diane Weber, a retired judge who had been on the original HOA formation committee with Thomas. The bylaws allow for removal of board members with a 2/3 vote. Just as the group began discussing next steps, a police cruiser pulled into Thomas's driveway, its lights flashing. The crowd fell silent as 2 officers approached, looking somewhat confused by the gathering. "We received a call about an unauthorized public assembly and potential safety hazards," the older officer explained, notepad in hand. "Something about an illegal pool that poses a drowning risk to neighborhood children." Thomas felt his face flush with anger. "Let me guess, Karen Westfield called you." The officer glanced at his notes. "I'm not at liberty to disclose who made the complaint, sir." From the back of the crowd, Mike's voice rang out. "I'm the HOA treasurer. There's no violation here. This is a properly called homeowners meeting." Janet Liu, who Thomas now learned was a civil rights attorney, stepped forward. "Officers, this is a private gathering on private property. Unless you have specific evidence of an imminent safety hazard or criminal activity, this falls well within protected assembly rights." The younger officer looked increasingly uncomfortable as he surveyed the orderly gathering of middle-aged and elderly homeowners sitting in lawn chairs. "Ma'am, we're just responding to a call." "And we appreciate your diligence," Janet replied smoothly. "Would you like some lemonade while you're here?" "We have plenty." While the younger officer declined, the older one, Officer Reynolds, according to his nameplate, pulled Thomas aside. "Look, Mr. Mitchell, I've responded to 6 calls from Ms. Westfield in the past month alone. Noise complaints about children playing basketball at 4 p.m., suspicious persons who turned out to be Amazon delivery drivers, and now this." He sighed, looking weary. "Just so you know, making false police reports can result in charges. If this continues, you might want to document these incidents." "I appreciate the heads up," Thomas replied, surprised by the officer's candor. As the police departed without taking any action, the meeting reconvened with renewed purpose. A vote was taken, and 43 homeowners unanimously supported initiating proceedings to remove Karen from the board. Thomas was elected to head the special committee that would formally present the petition at the next official board meeting. As neighbors lingered in his backyard, sharing stories and contact information, Thomas realized something remarkable had happened. Karen's overreach had inadvertently created precisely the kind of community bonding the HOA was supposed to foster in the first place. As the last neighbors departed, promising to attend the upcoming board meeting for support, Thomas's daughter Jessica called. "How did the meeting go, Dad?" she asked. "Better than I could have hoped," he replied, surveying his yard where neighbors had carefully returned chairs to their original positions and picked up every scrap of trash. "But Karen made a police complaint about the pool and the meeting." Jessica's attorney instincts immediately kicked in. "That's harassment, Dad. We can file for a cease and desist." Thomas considered this as he looked at his pool, which had become a symbol of resistance to petty tyranny. Not yet. The official board meeting is Tuesday night. Let's see what happens when Karen realizes she's not just fighting one retiree anymore. As Thomas hung up, his phone chimed with a text message. It was from an unknown number, but the content made his blood run cold. "You think you've won, but I've already filed a formal complaint with the county building inspector. Hope you kept your original permit paperwork. Pools installed without proper permits can result in fines." Monday morning arrived with the low rumble of an unfamiliar vehicle pulling into Thomas's driveway. Peering through his living room blinds, he saw a white county inspection van with the seal of the building's safety department emblazoned on its side. Thomas's stomach clenched as he watched a stern-looking man in a yellow safety vest exit the vehicle, clipboard in hand. "Unbelievable," Thomas muttered. "She actually did it." He opened his front door before the inspector could knock. "Good morning. I assume you're here about my pool." The inspector looked momentarily surprised. "Yes, sir. Mr. Mitchell?" "I'm Derek Sandoval from County Building Safety. We received a complaint about an unpermitted aquatic structure on your property." Thomas invited him in, maintaining a calm demeanor despite his internal panic. "Coffee?" It's fresh. No thanks, Derek replied, though his longing glance at the pot suggested otherwise. I just need to verify your permit status and do a safety inspection. As they walked through the house toward the backyard, Thomas decided on honesty. Look, Mr. Sandoval, the pool was installed by Westlake Pools 5 years ago. They handled all the permitting, but I'm having trouble locating the paperwork. The inspector nodded, unsurprised. That happens more often than you'd think. We can check the county database. Outside, Derek circled the pool, taking measurements and photographs. Thomas watched anxiously as the man made notes, his expression unreadable. Mr. Mitchell, Derek finally said, looking up from his clipboard, are you aware that there's an ongoing dispute between Westlake Pools and the county? They failed to properly file permits for dozens of installations between 2016 and 2019. Thomas felt his heart sink. No, I had no idea. Derek sighed. You're the third homeowner I've visited this month with this issue. The company's owner is facing charges for permit fraud. So my pool is illegal? Thomas asked, envisioning thousands in fines and the nightmare of removal. Technically, yes, Derek confirmed. But he continued, lowering his voice, the county's implementing an amnesty program for affected homeowners. The commissioners recognize it's not fair to punish people who paid in good faith for proper installation. Relief flooded through Thomas. What do I need to do? Fill out this retroactive permit application, Derek explained, handing him a form. There's a reduced fee of $150 instead of the usual $500, and we'll fast-track the inspection. Assuming everything meets code, which from what I can see, it does, you'll be properly permitted within 2 weeks. Thomas took the paperwork gratefully. I appreciate your understanding. Derek hesitated before adding, between us, Mr. Mitchell, I've received 8 complaints about pools in this neighborhood in the past 3 days, all from the same person. It's unusual, to say the least. Let me guess, Thomas said wryly. Karen Westfield. The inspector's raised eyebrow confirmed Thomas's suspicion. I can't comment on that, but I will say some people seem to use the complaint system for personal vendettas. He glanced at his watch. I should get going. I have 7 more inspections today, all in this neighborhood. After Derek left, Thomas immediately called Jessica to update her. She picked up on the first ring. Dad, I've been researching Karen Westfield, she said without preamble. You won't believe what I found. Try me, Thomas replied, sensing his daughter's excitement. She's done this before, Jessica explained. 3 different HOAs in the past 10 years. She moves in, gets elected to the board, creates chaos with arbitrary enforcement, pushes through vanity projects that inflate her property value, then sells at a premium and moves on. Thomas sat down heavily. You're saying this is a scam she runs? Exactly, Jessica confirmed. In her last community, she pushed through a $300,000 landscaping project that just happened to transform the common area near her property. She sold 3 months later for $80,000 above market value. This information changed everything. What had seemed like simple power tripping was actually a calculated financial scheme. The board meeting is tomorrow night, Thomas said thoughtfully. I need to present this information. I'm emailing you everything I found, Jessica replied. Public records, news articles about the disputes, property sales data, it's all documented. Thomas spent the rest of the day preparing, printing documents, and creating presentation boards. He had just finished when his doorbell rang. Outside stood Diane Weber, the retired judge, holding a thick manila envelope. I thought you might need this, she said, handing it to Thomas. Inside was the original pool approval documentation from 5 years ago, complete with signatures from the previous board. Diane, this is incredible. How did you get this? She smiled, her eyes twinkling. I kept copies of all approvals during my time on the architectural committee. Karen might control the current files, but she can't erase history. Armed with both Diane's documentation and Jessica's research, Thomas felt prepared for the showdown at Tuesday's board meeting. But as he would soon discover, Karen had no intention of allowing that meeting to proceed fairly. The following morning, Thomas's phone began buzzing with text messages from neighbors. The official HOA email account had sent out an announcement. The board meeting location had been changed from the community pavilion to Karen's living room due to maintenance issues, and attendance would be limited to board members only due to space constraints. It was a transparent attempt to exclude the growing opposition. Thomas immediately fired back a response to all neighbors, citing the HOA bylaw requiring meetings to be held in accessible locations with space for any homeowner who wished to attend. By noon, Karen sent another email, moving the meeting to a restaurant 20 miles away with a note that each attendee will be responsible for purchasing dinner to secure their place at the meeting. She's getting desperate, Mike told Thomas over the phone. She knows she's losing control. The community rallied, with dozens of neighbors agreeing to make the drive and pay for meals they didn't want just to attend the meeting. But at 3 p.m., a final email arrived. Due to unexpected circumstances, tonight's OO board meeting is canceled. All agenda items will be handled via email vote by current board members only. Results will be shared within 30 days as required by bylaws. Karen was attempting to shut down the democratic process entirely. As Thomas stared at the email in disbelief, his phone rang. It was Richard Patel. "We're not letting her get away with this," Richard said firmly. "Mike, Diane, and I are board members, and we're calling an emergency session. My house, 7 p.m. We have quorum without Karen." "Is that legal?" Thomas asked. "Absolutely," Richard replied. "The bylaws allow any 3 board members to call an emergency session in extraordinary circumstances. I'd say a president attempting to subvert democratic proceedings qualifies." That evening, as Thomas gathered his materials to head to Richard's house, he glanced out his window to see Karen parked across the street, watching his home with binoculars from her SUV. The confrontation was reaching its boiling point, and Thomas knew that whatever happened at tonight's emergency board meeting would determine whether his neighborhood remained under Karen's thumb or reclaimed its community spirit. What he couldn't have anticipated was that before the night was over, police sirens would once again be screaming down Oakwood Drive, and this time, the consequences would be far more serious than a warning. The emergency board meeting at Richard Patel's house had just reached its most critical moment. Mike, Richard, and Diane, constituting a legitimate quorum of the 5-member board, had unanimously voted to remove Karen as HOA president due to documented ethics violations. Thomas had presented his evidence methodically, and nearly 30 homeowners had witnessed the proceedings. "According to our bylaws," Diane announced, "the vice president, which is me, will assume presidential duties until a special election can be held next month. This meeting is no." The sound of screeching tires outside interrupted her. Through Richard's front window, Thomas watched as Karen's silver SUV skidded to a halt at the curb. She emerged, face contorted with rage, her phone clutched in her hand. "I think we're about to have company," Thomas warned the room. Karen didn't bother knocking. She flung open Richard's front door with such force that it banged against the wall, leaving a small dent in the drywall. The room fell instantly silent as she stormed in, scanning the assembled neighbors with undisguised contempt. "This meeting is illegal," she announced, her voice trembling with anger. "I've already contacted my attorney." Richard stepped forward, calm but firm. "Karen, as you can see from the attendance, 3 board members called this emergency session in accordance with Section 4, Article 7 of our bylaws. We have minutes, recordings, and witnesses." "You got no right." Karen's voice rose to a shout. "I am the president of this association." "Not anymore," Diane replied, holding up the official resolution they had just signed. "You've been removed from office for ethics violations effective immediately." Karen's face blanched, then flushed deep red. "You can't do this to me. Do you have any idea who I am? Who my husband is?" Mike spoke up, his voice steady. "We know exactly who you are, Karen. We've seen the documentation of your activities in 3 previous communities. The pattern is clear." For a moment, Karen seemed genuinely taken aback that her history had been uncovered. Then her expression hardened into something calculated and cold. She pulled out her phone again. "Fine. If that's how you want to play this," she said, stepping back toward the door. "But this isn't over." After she left, the meeting concluded with Diane being officially installed as interim president. As neighbors departed, there was a palpable sense of relief and victory. Thomas accepted congratulations and thanks from people who just days ago had been strangers despite years of living on the same street. "We couldn't have done this without you," Janet Liu told him, squeezing his arm. "You stood up when most of us were too intimidated to act." It was nearly 11 when Thomas finally headed home, walking the short distance from Richard's house with a lightness in his step that he hadn't felt in months. The night was quiet and still, a sort of perfect early summer evening that had drawn him to this neighborhood in the first place. As Thomas approached his house, he noticed something odd. His front door was slightly ajar, spilling light onto the porch. He was certain he had closed and locked it before leaving for the meeting. Cautiously, he pushed the door open wider. "Hello," he called out. There was no response, but he heard rustling coming from his home office. Thomas grabbed an umbrella from the stand by the door, the closest thing to a weapon within reach, and moved slowly down the hallway. The door to his office was open, light streaming out. He peered around the corner to find Karen rifling through his desk drawers, pulling out files and tossing them aside. She was muttering to herself, clearly searching for something specific. "What the hell are you doing in my house?" Thomas demanded, startling Karen so badly that she knocked over a cup of pens. "Thomas," she gasped, momentarily thrown off guard before regaining her composure. "I'm collecting evidence. You've stolen HOA documents, official records that belong to the association." "That's absurd," Thomas said, anger rising. "You broke into my home. That's a criminal offense." Karen smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach her eyes. "The door was unlocked. I had reason to believe you were concealing documents relevant to an ongoing HOA investigation. As president, you're not the president anymore, Thomas interrupted. And even if you were, that wouldn't give you the right to enter my home without permission. Get out now, or I'm calling the police. Something dangerous flashed in Karen's eyes. Go ahead. Call them. My husband plays golf with the police chief every Sunday. Thomas pulled out his phone. Last chance, Karen. Leave now. Instead of retreating, Karen suddenly lunged forward, grabbing a folder from Thomas's desk, the one containing all of Jessica's research and Diane's documentation about the pool approval. This is association property, she declared, clutching it to her chest. Put that down and get out. Thomas stepped toward her, reaching for the folder. What happened next would later be disputed in multiple statements to police. Karen would claim Thomas grabbed her arm violently. Thomas would maintain that he only reached for the folder. What was certain was that Karen suddenly screamed at a volume that startled even herself, then flung herself backward dramatically, knocking over a bookshelf in the process. Help! He's attacking me! She shrieked, though there was no one else in the house to hear. Thomas stepped back, shocked by the theatrical display. Karen, stop this nonsense and leave my house. Instead, she pulled out her phone and to Thomas's disbelief dialed 911. Emergency, please help. She cried into the phone, her voice transformed into a terrified whimper. I'm at 1422 Oakwood Drive. The homeowner is assaulting me. He's blocking the door and threatening me. Please hurry. Thomas couldn't believe what he was hearing. That's completely false, he protested, but Karen only retreated further into the corner, continuing her performance for the 911 operator.